It didn't start with violence. It didn't start with shouting. It started with a soft tone, a kind smile, and a subtle pull towards something you didn't notice until much later. Until your voice was quieter. Until your choices felt like permission. Until you became someone even you couldn't recognize. They didn't love you. They loved the version of you that stayed manageable. The version that said yes before asking why. The version that adjusted just enough to keep the peace. You were taught that love meant accommodation, that devotion meant self-erasure, that care was expressed through correction. But let's be honest now. When they said, "I love you," what they really meant was, "I love what you are, when you don't disrupt me." Thomas Erikson called this dynamic emotional framing, where your identity is only valid when it serves their emotional comfort. And if you stepped outside of that role, even slightly, you were punished. Not with words, but with silence, with cold eyes, with absence. And the worst part, they told you it was your fault. You were too emotional, too intense, too sensitive. You loved too loudly. You thought too deeply. You questioned too much. You became the problem because the real you couldn't be controlled. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And that's what they were doing with you. They didn't want connection. They wanted control. And control doesn't seek truth. It seeks obedience. So they molded you, bit by bit, with every raised eyebrow, with every dismissive sigh, with every carefully crafted sentence that sounded like concern, but felt like a cage. You were not loved. You were edited. Maybe it was the way you dressed, or the way you spoke, or the fact that you cried at things they didn't understand. At first they said it was just a suggestion. Later it became a standard. Eventually it became an unspoken rule. Be what they need, or become invisible. And so you bent, you compromised, you diluted yourself, until you were palatable, acceptable, controllable. But inside, you were screaming. You just didn't know if anyone would believe you. Because everything looked fine on the outside. They were polite, charming. They called you the love of their life. And yet, you felt small, tense, confused. That's the thing about emotional control. It never bruises your skin, it bruises your reality. You started to wonder if you were overreacting, if you were too much, if your boundaries were actually flaws. And they confirmed it, subtly, masterfully, with phrases like, "I just want what's best for you. I didn't mean it like that. Why do you always take things the wrong way?" They played the victim of your pain, and you started apologizing for bleeding. That's not love. That's psychological disassembly. They didn't love your presence. They loved your compliance. Here's the truth. They weren't afraid of losing you. They were afraid of losing control over you. They needed you to be agreeable, to doubt yourself, to question your instinct. Because the moment you remembered who you were, the moment you said no without guilt, the illusion would collapse. And it did. You started noticing how they shifted when you set boundaries, how they became colder when you didn't explain yourself, how their love suddenly felt like strategy. Because it was. Thomas Erikson described these dynamics as silent manipulation tactics, a slow erosion of self, wrapped in emotional logic. They didn't yell. They didn't demand. They suggested. They hinted. They made you feel guilty for breathing too loudly in a room they claimed to have built for your safety. But it was never your room. It was theirs, and your role was to stay quiet and grateful. But the problem is, you woke up. You noticed the bars on the windows, the invisible rule, the shrinking space where your real self once lived, and you started walking toward the door, not to escape, but to return, to yourself. Don't let anyone convince you it was your fault. You weren't unstable. You weren't dramatic. You were finally seeing the truth. They didn't love you. They loved the version of you they could control. And now that version is gone. Now you're dangerous, because now you're free. They didn't say don't be yourself. They didn't need to. They gave you rules. Quiet ones. Unwritten. Unspoken. But deeply enforced. You learned them fast. Don't get too emotional. Don't question too much. Don't outshine them. Don't disrupt their comfort. And if you did, you didn't get punished with anger. You got punished with silence, distant, that cold, aching withdrawal that made you feel like you'd broken something. Even when all you did was speak your truth. They taught you that love is earned through compliance, that safety is granted in exchange for self-censorship. So you adapted. You shrunk yourself into what they need. You didn't even realize it was happening at first. You just wanted things to work. You just wanted peace. You thought love required compromise. But it wasn't compromise. It was submission. Slow, subtle, invisible. They gave you rules and called it love. Thomas Erikson writes that emotional control doesn't always come from rage. Sometimes it comes from worry, from care, from phrases like, "I'm just trying to help." But that help always comes with a price, and the price is always you, your intuition, your freedom, your sense of self. They needed to be the expert. Even about you, your emotions, too much, your instincts, probably wrong, your goals, not realistic. And when you disagreed, you weren't met with discussion. You were met with defensiveness, with dismissal, with guilt. Why are you making me the bad guy? I'm just looking out for you. But love doesn't make you question your reality. Love doesn't make you walk on eggshells around someone who says they adore you. Love doesn't feel like a maze where every wrong step triggers emotional distance. You didn't imagine it. You were being trained, and the goal wasn't connection. It was control. Control over your mood, your language, your timing, your reactions. They watched you closely, not to understand you but to manage you. They learned what made you soften, what made you apologize, what made you doubt yourself, and they used it, silently, repeatedly, strategically. It wasn't a relationship, it was emotional conditioning. And the scariest part, you thanked them for it. You thanked them for their patience, for their honesty. You blamed yourself for being too reactive, too difficult, too emotional, because they never told you to silence yourself. They just made you believe that your voice was the problem. Carl Jung warned that what we repress becomes the force that controls. You repressed your truth for so long it began to feel dangerous to speak it. But your truth was never the threat. Their comfort was never more important than your clarity. And your fear of making them uncomfortable, that fear was the very leash they used to keep you small. You weren't loved, you were managed. And the moment you started breaking those rules, you saw it. The shift, the coldness, the way their words turned. You've changed. I don't even recognize you anymore. You used to be so easy to be around. Translation: you stopped performing. You stopped bending. You stopped shrinking to fit their comfort zone. And now you were no longer useful. Let that truth sink in. The love they gave had conditions. Be soft, be silent, be small. The moment you stepped out of that script, the love vanished, because it was never love. It was control disguised as connection. And now that you see it, everything clicks. All the nights you couldn't sleep, wondering why you felt anxious around someone who said they loved you. All the confusion, the self-blame, the exhaustion. It wasn't you. It was the cost of living in a story where your needs were always too loud, and theirs were always urgent. Thomas Erikson wrote that people who use emotional control don't want a partner. They want a mirror, something to reflect back the image they've crafted of themselves. You were never allowed to be whole, only agreeable, only convenient. And the moment you became real, they called it disrespect. You never broke the relationship. You broke the illusion, and that illusion was the only thing holding it together. You didn't change too much. You simply became too honest, too awake, too aware, and they weren't prepared for that. Because people who build their identity on control are terrified of those who no longer need permission to be themselves. They didn't love you. They loved the mask you wore to survive them. And now that it's off, they're gone. Let them be. You're not alone. You're just free. They didn't withdraw because they were hurt. They withdrew to train you, to condition you. Silence wasn't absence. It was control, cold, calculated, and timed perfectly to make you question yourself. The distance wasn't random. It followed every boundary you tried to set, every time you spoke your truth, every moment you asked for clarity, and every time it worked. You softened, you apologized, you walked back your feelings, and they knew you. That's what makes emotional control so effective. It's quiet, it's strategic, it looks like detachment but it's punishment, and the person being punished is always the one who dared to be real. You thought they needed space, you gave it. You thought they were overwhelmed, you stayed calm. You thought they just needed time, but what they really needed was for you to fold, for you to internalize the idea that your authenticity was dangerous, that your emotional needs were too much, that your clarity made you the villain. Thomas Erikson calls this the silent training loop, a pattern where one person uses withdrawal and coldness as tools to shape the other's behavior. And over time it works. You stop saying what you feel. You stop asking for reassurance. You stop being human, just to avoid losing their attention again. And the most painful part, you begin to see it as your fault. You begin to believe that emotional closeness is something you must earn by being easier, quieter, less. They don't ask you to change directly. They don't need to. The silence does the work. Because distance, when used strategically, is more powerful than words. It makes you feel abandoned, but not completely. Just enough to trigger your fear of losing the connection. Just enough to make you beg for harmony again. Just enough to make you shrink on your own. This isn't love, it's behavioral control. It's a slow reprogramming of your nervous system. Your body starts to flinch at your own voice. You begin to sense that expressing yourself comes at a cost. And that cost is connection. They made you believe you were safe only when you were silent, and that belief shaped everything. The way you walked into rooms, the way you asked for help, the way you learned to disappear before anyone could push you away. You weren't needy, you were starved. Starved for clarity, starved for consistency, starved for real emotional presence. But what they offered was conditional. Warmth, only when you complied. Affection, only when you adapted. Closeness, only when you played by their rules. And if you broke them, you were punished. Not loudly, but completely. Jung warned that when a person refuses to confront their inner chaos, they project order onto the people around them, through control, through manipulation, through emotional withdrawal. What they were running from wasn't you, it was themselves, and you were the collateral damage. You stopped being a person, you became a reflection, a tool, a buffer for their own discomfort. And every time you tried to reclaim yourself, you were met with coldness, not because they were hurt, but because they were terrified of losing control over the narrative. And when the narrative breaks, they leave, or worse, they stay and make you feel like you're the one who broke everything. Let's be clear, asking for emotional safety is not being demanding. Wanting to be seen is not too much. Naming your needs is not disrespect. These are basic forms of intimacy. But in the world of emotional control, your needs are threats, your clarity is dangerous, and your boundaries are rebellion. So they silence you without a word. They pull back their presence. They let you sit in confusion, hoping you'll come back crawling, ready to apologize for needing more than a script. And for a while you did. You made excuses for them. You tried to be more understanding. You blamed yourself for the distance. But the truth is, they were never reaching for you. They were reaching for dominance. And when dominance is the goal, intimacy dies. They didn't walk away to think. They didn't disappear to reflect. They stepped back because they knew exactly what that silence would do to you. That's not emotional immaturity. That's manipulation with precision. Thomas Erikson reminds us that emotional withdrawal is the adult version of punishment. It's the child who crosses their arms and turns away, but now with a vocabulary that sounds mature. I just need space. I don't want to argue. You're overthinking again. But what they mean is, get back in line. Be who I need you to be, or I won't come back. You can't build love on those terms. Not real love, not lasting connection. Because when closeness depends on compliance, all you have is performance. And you were never meant to be a performer. You were meant to be known. So if their distance became your anxiety, if their silence made you question your sanity, if their absence taught you how to beg for crumbs, then understand this: they didn't love you. They loved how easily you could be shaped. And now that you see it, they're losing grip. Because now, you're no longer afraid of the silence. Now you're learning to sit in it, not as punishment, but as power. Your power. And that terrifies them more than anything. They didn't want you strong. They didn't want you clear. They didn't want you healed. Because the stronger you became, the less they could shape you. The clearer you got, the harder it was to gaslight you. The more whole you felt, the less you needed their approval to breathe. That terrified them, because their power didn't come from love. It came from your fragmentation. You were easier to manage when you doubted yourself, when you apologized too quickly, when you asked for permission to feel, when you walked into the room already softened, already silenced, already scanning their mood so you could adjust your own. They didn't say, shrink for me, but they praised you when you did. They called you balanced when you held in your rage. They called you mature when you swallowed your sadness. They called you good when you ignored your own needs, just to keep the atmosphere light.
And that praise, it trained you, rewarded you, conditioned you, because survival always adapts to safety, even if safety is toxic. Thomas Erikson writes that emotional control often hides behind subtle reward systems, a raised eyebrow, a sigh of disappointment, a moment of extra attention when you're obedient. Emotional manipulators don't always need rules, they just need you to crave harmony. And once you do, you'll keep yourself in check. You'll police your tone. You'll hesitate before speaking. You'll smile when you want to scream, and they won't even have to say a word, because you've already internalized the script. And what script was that? Be agreeable, be easy to manage, be predictable, be quiet, don't cry too loudly, don't love too boldly, don't want too much, don't remind them of their inability to meet you where you are. Because your depth confronted their hollowness, your emotional honesty exposed their denial, your desire for growth made their stagnation uncomfortable. And so they minimized you, slowly, casually, consistently, with jokes that weren't funny, with questions that made you doubt your decisions, with advice that felt more like correction, with comparisons that reminded you how replaceable they believed you were, all wrapped in tones of love, in smiles that didn't reach the eyes, in sentences that started with "I care about you." This wasn't love, it was emotional dominance, disguised as guidance. They didn't want you to grow, they wanted you to stay useful, to be the one who carried the weight of the relationship, to do the emotional labor, to take responsibility for the connection, even when they were the ones damaging it. And when you got tired, when you started reclaiming your voice, they called you cold, difficult, unreasonable, not because you were any of those things, but because you stopped being controllable. Jung warned that people project their inner void onto others, that those who haven't faced themselves need others to carry their shadow. You were their mirror, and as long as you reflected what they needed to see, their strength, their stability, their worth, they called it love. But the moment you reflected their avoidance, their manipulation, their fear, you became the enemy. They didn't love you, they loved their reflection in you. And the day you stopped reflecting, they stopped reaching. Let that sink in. Their connection with you was conditional. It existed as long as you served a function, the function of emotional reassurance, of silence, of admiration, of soft compliance, not because they were cruel, but because they were empty, and your wholeness became a threat. They needed you small to feel, they needed you unsure to feel wise, they needed you apologizing to feel right. But that wasn't your role, that was their system. A system designed to keep you dependent, uncertain, and exhausted, so they could keep feeling powerful without ever having to grow. But the truth, you outgrew it, and you're still outgrowing it. Every time you speak when it's uncomfortable, every time you set a boundary, every time you stop explaining your worth to someone committed to misunderstanding it, that's healing, that's power, that's what they hoped you'd never discover. And now that you have, they'll say you've changed, they'll say you're angry, they'll say you've lost yourself, but you haven't. You've returned. You're not harder. You're clearer. You're not colder. You're no longer available for emotional blackmail. They didn't love you. They loved the version of you that kept them comfortable. And now that you've stopped being that version, you're finally free. They never needed to understand you. They just needed you to explain yourself enough to stay in control. Every clarification, every apology, every over-explained feeling, it fed them, not because they cared, but because it made them feel superior, in control, in charge of how you defined your own truth. They watched you doubt yourself. They watched you walk back your words, soften your voice, make excuses for the pain they caused, and they did nothing to stop it, because they liked you better like that. Quiet, apologetic, manageable. But the moment you stopped explaining, everything changed. The moment you let your silence speak for itself, the moment you drew a boundary without justifying it, the moment you said, "This doesn't feel right," without providing footnotes, you became dangerous, not violent, not aggressive, dangerous, because the most dangerous person in any system of control is the one who no longer asks for permission to be whole. You stopped debating your worth. You stopped asking to be understood. You stopped begging for empathy that should have been offered freely. And they didn't know what to do with that, because suddenly, the emotional upper hand was gone. Thomas Erikson warns that once a manipulator loses their grip, they will either escalate or disappear. And when you stopped explaining yourself, you forced them to choose. For some, That meant guilt tripping you back into submission. For others, it meant walking away in silence, leaving you with the final illusion that you were too much. But you weren't too much. You were finally becoming whole. Explaining is what kept you trapped. Every time you tried to prove you were good, every time you tried to convince them you didn't mean harm, every time you handed them your emotional journal, hoping they'd read it with compassion, they didn't. They read it like a manual, a guidebook, a blueprint on how to shape you further. So you stopped. You stopped sharing your softest truths with someone who used them to sharpen their control. You stopped offering transparency to someone who only gave you confusion in return. You stopped performing emotional CPR on a dynamic that never saw you as a human, only as a reflection. And in that silence, something beautiful happened. You heard your own voice again, the one that was buried under all the overthinking, the one that used to say, "This doesn't feel safe," the one that whispered, "You're not crazy," the one that tried to protect you, before you learned to silence it in favor of peace. That was never peace. Carl Jung wrote that the most terrifying journey is the journey inward, because it requires facing everything we've ignored, everything we've softened, everything we've explained away. And when you stopped explaining yourself, you took that journey, alone, unapplauded, but with clarity. You weren't cruel, you were clear, you weren't distant, you were finally grounded, you weren't breaking anything, you were finally honoring everything. And yes, people who benefited from your confusion will always call your clarity selfish. They'll say you've changed. They'll say, you used to be easier, but of course you were easier. You were exhausted, you were walking on eggshells, you were managing their emotions while silencing your own. Now, you're no longer manageable, you're no longer soft in the face of manipulation, you're no longer bending to stay in rooms that drained you, and that is what makes you powerful. Because the world is not used to women who no longer explain themselves. It fears them, mislabels them, calls them cold, rigid, detached. But what it's really saying is, we don't know how to control you anymore. You became dangerous the moment you stopped offering emotional access to people who never earned it. You became dangerous the moment you let someone's silence be their answer, and moved forward anyway. You became dangerous the moment you loved yourself enough to walk away without a monologue. And now, you're free, not because they gave you freedom, but because you stopped negotiating your voice for their approval. They didn't love you, they loved how easy you were to shape. Now that you've reclaimed yourself, they call it selfish. But you know better. It's not selfishness, it's sovereignty. In the end, they'll rewrite the story. They'll tell others you changed, that you became distant, that you were too demanding, too cold, too difficult. They'll leave out the part where they made you question your identity, where they measured your worth in obedience, where they shaped your love into something they could control, and then blamed you when it broke. Because in their story they're always the one who tried, the one who did everything, the one who loved you so much. But the truth is, what they loved wasn't you, it was the role you played, and the fact that you played it so well for so long, without asking for anything real in return. And when you finally stopped performing, you became the villain in their narrative. But you were never the villain, you were the exit, the mirror, the shift, the one who dared to say, "This isn't love," and in doing so you shattered the illusion they worked so hard to protect. Thomas Erikson wrote that the most dangerous people are not the ones who destroy others, but the ones who reveal systems built on denial. That's who you were, not a destroyer, a revealer. You showed them what it looks like when someone refuses to live as a reflection, and that exposure, that truth, it terrified them, because now, they have to face what they tried to escape through controlling you, their emptiness, their avoidance, their fear of true intimacy. You didn't cause that, you just stopped covering it. You were not the problem, you were the awakening, and still you carry guilt, because that's what emotional control does. It conditions you to feel guilty for choosing yourself. It teaches you that love means sacrifice, that saying no is betrayal, that boundaries are violence, but they're not. They're protection, they're truth, they're a declaration. I will not disappear, for the sake of being loved. Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. You paid for that privilege with your tears, with your silence, with your confusion. But now, here you are, standing in the ashes of a love that was never real, and realizing, you're still breathing, you're still here, and you're finally beginning to live on your own terms. You were never too much, you were just too alive for someone who needed you quiet. You were never difficult. You were just incompatible with emotional manipulation. You were never the problem. You were the end of the pattern. You didn't leave because you stopped loving. You left because you started loving yourself, and that's what broke the cycle. So let them rewrite the story. Let them say what they need to say to protect their version of events. You no longer need to defend your healing. You no longer need to explain your freedom, because anyone who truly sees you will never ask you to explain why you chose peace. You don't owe anyone closure, not when their silence was their clearest answer, not when their control wore the mask of care, not when their love demanded your erasure. You were the mirror, the interruption, the exit. They didn't love you. They loved controlling who you were, but that control is broken, and now, you're finally becoming who you've always been. Before the silence, before the shame, before the performance, you fully, freely